The alarm went off at 7:15, same as always. Sergei reached over and turned it off before it could wake Natasha. He did this automatically, the way he did most morning things, efficiently, without thought, as a matter of being the person who handled the details so that others didn't have to. He got up. He went to the bathroom. He showered, shaved, looked at himself in the mirror the way a man looks at himself in the mirror when he is checking something that isn't his face. He put on the good shirt, the gray one, the one he wore to important meetings. He went down to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window while it brewed. The street was doing its ordinary morning thing, a woman walking a small dog, a delivery van pulling up outside the building opposite, two pigeons negotiating something on the curb. He watched it without seeing it. He poured his coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He had nowhere to be. This was the 4th week. If you've ever put on the good shirt when there was no reason to put on the good shirt, you already know something about where this goes. Stay with it. Sergei was 47. He'd worked at the company for 11 years, which in the current climate was either a long time or an eternity, depending on who was counting. He'd come in as a department lead and been promoted twice and had managed, at his peak, a team of 14 people across 2 offices. He knew the systems, the clients, the politics of the place. He knew which accounts needed handling carefully and which could be left to run, and which were quietly dying and would need to be managed out before they became someone else's problem. He was good at his job. He knew he was good at his job. He had never once doubted this. The letter had come on a Thursday. Not even a meeting, a letter. Human resources, 2 paragraphs, the language of restructuring and strategic realignment, and the company's gratitude for his years of service. His direct manager had called 20 minutes later, slightly apologetic in the practiced way of people who've made these calls before. Sergei had said, "I understand." He'd said, "Thank you for letting me know." He'd said, "I appreciate the call." He'd driven home, parked in the usual spot, sat in the car for 11 minutes by the dashboard clock, and then come inside and said nothing. He'd told Natasha he had a day working from home. He told her there was a shift in some project timelines, nothing major, just some regrouping. She'd nodded and gone back to her own work, because this was the kind of thing that was said in their house, competent words about managed situations, and she'd learned over 22 years of marriage to take his assessments at face value. He had told himself he would tell her that weekend. That had been 4 weeks ago. He went out every morning at 8:30. He had a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away where they didn't know him, where he could sit with his laptop for 3 hours and look like a man who was between meetings, rather than between everything. He sent emails. He called a few contacts. He applied for 3 positions in the first week, and then slowed down because the applications felt like admissions, and he was not ready to admit anything. He came home at the time he used to come home. He made normal conversation at dinner. He was very, very tired. His son, Andrei, was 16. Andrei was at the age where he existed in the house with the particular quality of a person who was partly elsewhere, present at meals, occasionally verbal, but largely in his room with his headphones and his laptop and whatever the interior life of a 16-year-old contained. Sergei and Andrei had a functional relationship. They talked about football, about school, about things Andrei was interested in the way you talk about things when you want to demonstrate interest. They didn't talk about feelings, which Sergei had always understood as appropriate rather than inadequate. That was how it worked. That was how it had worked with his own father, who had been a man of action and few words, and Sergei had turned out fine. Natasha was the one Andrei talked to. Sergei had always known this and always been slightly grateful for it, because it meant there was a system. She handled the emotional terrain, he handled the practical. It was efficient. It worked. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee on a Tuesday morning, 2 hours after pretending to leave for work, and he thought about what he used to do at this time on a Tuesday. He used to be in the office. He used to be standing at the whiteboard in the third-floor meeting room, going through quarterly targets. He used to have 14 people who waited to hear what he thought. He drank his coffee. The apartment was quiet. He opened his laptop and looked at his inbox. 3 unread emails, none of them about jobs. He closed the laptop. He thought about calling someone. He had a list in his head of people he could call, former colleagues, contacts. One man named Victor from a previous job who'd always said, "If you ever need anything." He had the list. He'd had the list for 4 weeks. He hadn't called anyone on it. He thought about why, and the answer came quickly and without judgment, which was the worst way for a true thing to arrive. Because calling meant explaining, and explaining meant asking, and asking meant being the man who needed something, and he had spent 47 years being the man who provided things, and those were not the same man, and he didn't know how to be both. He put his phone face down on the table. He put on the good shirt and left the apartment. He went to the coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away and ordered his usual, and sat at the table near the window and opened his laptop and looked like a man between meetings. 3 weeks earlier, he'd run into a former colleague at the grocery store. Mikhail. They'd worked together for 6 years, overlapping entirely, and Mikhail had left the company 2 years ago for a competitor, which had been handled with the right amount of professional courtesy. They'd been what Sergei would have called friends within the context. Lunch sometimes, the occasional drink after a long day, the kind of friendship that existed inside a job and didn't always survive outside one. Mikhail had been glad to see him. That was genuine. He'd said, "Sergei, how are you? How's the family? We should catch up properly." He'd said, "I heard about the restructuring. That whole floor got cleared out. It's brutal." He'd said, "If you're looking around, I might know someone." Sergei had said, "I'm not looking. I'm taking some time. It's planned." Mikhail had looked at him for a beat, just a beat, the look of a person who had heard the sentence and noticed the gap between it and something else. "Well, if that changes," Mikhail said. "Seriously. Call me." "Appreciate it," Sergei said. They'd said goodbye. Sergei had gone down the produce aisle and stood in front of the tomatoes for a long time without registering them. On the drive home, he'd thought about calling Mikhail. He'd thought about it specifically and deliberately, the way he thought through problems at work, identifying the action, assessing the cost, determining whether the return justified the expenditure. The cost was admitting he was looking, admitting that taking some time was not a plan, admitting that Mikhail's offer of help was not a professional courtesy to be logged and ignored, but an actual thing he actually needed. He hadn't called. The Wednesday of the 4th week started normally. He made coffee, watched the street, put on the shirt, left at 8:30. He went to the coffee shop. He stayed 3 hours. He answered an email from a recruiter that said nothing useful, and he sent a reply that said nothing useful in return, which was the nature of recruiter emails. He refreshed his phone once, twice, 6 times. He drove home at the time he usually came home. Natasha was in the kitchen. She had that day working from home, which she sometimes did on Wednesdays. She was at the table with a laptop and a cup of tea gone slightly cold, and she looked up when he came in, with a specific expression he'd been dreading for 4 weeks. Not quite suspicious, not quite worried, but attentive in the way she got when she was picking up something she hadn't been told. "You're early," she said. "Meeting cancelled," he said. He went to the refrigerator. He looked at it without wanting anything from it. "Sergei." He closed the refrigerator. He turned. She was looking at him. She had her hands around the cold tea and she was looking at him in the way she'd looked at him for 22 years. Fully, without pretense, the look that had always both comforted and unnerved him because it saw more than he intended to show. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" she said. "Nothing's happening." Sergei, still quiet, not angry, just present. "I said nothing's happening. I'm managing something at work. It's temporary." "I called the office on Thursday," she said, "to reach you because your mobile was off. They put me through to someone I didn't know, and she said she wasn't sure you were currently on the team." The refrigerator hummed. Sergei looked at the floor. He thought about all the different things he could say. He thought about them rapidly, the way his mind had always worked, assessing, selecting, deploying the most effective option. He could say it was a miscommunication. He could say there'd been a departmental change. He could say the woman hadn't had current information. He looked at Natasha's face. He said, "It's fine. I'm handling it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Okay." And she went back to her laptop. This was the worst possible outcome. Not a fight. A fight would have been cleaner, would have opened something. Just, okay. Just her reading something on her screen. Just the accommodation of a woman who had learned over 22 years that certain doors in this house didn't open unless he opened them, and who was not going to force anything. He went to his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk. He didn't turn the computer on. He sat at his desk in the room that had his books and his things, the room that had been his in the way that rooms become yours not through choice, but through occupation, and he put his hands on the desk and he sat. He thought, she knows. He thought, she's known for a while. He thought, she's been waiting. He thought about the accounts payable. He thought about the mortgage payment coming at the end of the month, the car insurance, Andre's school trip in the spring that they'd said yes to without thinking about it because 3 months ago the word no wasn't in the vocabulary of a man like Sergei. He thought about the savings, which were not as comfortable as he'd always implied they were, which had a specific number attached to them that he had been looking at in his banking app every few days with the particular attention of a person watching water drain. He thought, I need to call Mikhail. He thought, I need to tell Natasha. He thought, I don't know how. He heard, from down the hallway, Andre's door open. Footsteps. The kitchen. The sound of a cabinet, the refrigerator. Then Andre's voice and Natasha's voice, low, indistinct. A normal afternoon sound. Then Andre's footsteps back down the hallway. A pause outside the study door. A knock. Dad? Not now, Sergei said. A moment, then footsteps back to Andre's room. He sat at his desk. He put his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at them and he thought, 47 years. He thought, I have built this. The apartment, the job, the family, the routine. He thought, I have been the person who carried things, and not one of those things has ever been asked to carry me back. He thought, that was the arrangement. He thought, I made that arrangement. He thought, I don't know what to do with a part where it breaks. Some things get passed down without anyone meaning to pass them. A way of holding your jaw. A way of leaving a room when things get heavy. A way of saying, I'm fine, that closes a door so thoroughly, the people on the other side stop knocking. Leave a comment if you know where you learned yours. We'll keep going. The following Saturday, his brother called. Gennady was 3 years older and lived in another city, and called on irregular schedules in the way of brothers who had grown up close and drifted into parallel lives. They talked about practical things, their mother's health, money when it came up, football. They did not talk about how things were. Gennady called to say their mother's knee was bothering her again, and someone should probably look into getting her some additional help around the house, and who was going to handle that? This was a reasonable question. In other circumstances, Sergei would have said, "I'll look into it." He would have made a few calls, found a solution, reported back. That was the system. He said, "I'll look into it." He said this automatically, before he'd thought about it, before he'd done the math on whether there was a number in his banking app that accommodated looking into things. Gennady said, "You sure? I can help with the cost if it's—" "I've got it," Sergei said. "Sergei, I'm not—" "I said I've got it." A silence. "Okay," Gennady said, the same word Natasha had used, the same accommodation. The same door being allowed to close. After the call, Sergei sat on the edge of the bed. He thought about his brother offering to help. He thought about the way he'd heard the offer, not as generosity, but as implication, as if accepting meant confirming something, admitting something, becoming something smaller than what he'd built himself to be. He thought Gennady was trying to help. He thought, I told him I didn't need it. He thought, I don't know if I believe that anymore. He lay back on the bed. Natasha was in the other room. He could hear her moving around. He lay on the bed in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, in his good apartment, in his good life, and he stared at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in 4 weeks, the thing he'd been carrying without naming. Not the fear of not finding a new job, though that was there. Not the money, though that was there. Something older than both of those. The particular fear of a man who has built himself into a shape, and then discovered that the shape had an inside, and the inside was dark, and he'd been sealing it off for so long he'd forgotten there was a door. He lay on the bed until he heard it. Andrei's voice from his room, which shared a wall with the bedroom, on the phone or on a game, not quite audible, and then, clearly, the sentence, "A man doesn't complain, you just deal with it." Said casually. Said the way you say a thing you've absorbed so thoroughly, it doesn't feel like a thing someone told you. It feels like a fact about the world. Said with the confidence of a 16-year-old who has learned something from somewhere and is now passing it on. Sergei lay completely still. He thought, he learned that from me. He thought about Andrei at 10, 11, 12, the boy who'd come to him with scraped knees and been told, walk it off. The boy who'd cried at a football loss and been told, don't let them see you. The boy who was now 16 and had his headphones and his room and his interior life that Sergei knew nothing about, because Andrei had learned, just as Sergei had learned from his own father, that certain things were not brought to certain people. He thought, I have made another one of me. He thought, I have taken my fear and given it to my son and called it strength. He sat up. He sat on the edge of the bed, and he put his hands on his knees, and he breathed. Not dramatic, just breathed. The room was the room. The ceiling was the ceiling. Andrei's voice had moved on to something else, something that wasn't audible. He sat there for a while, then he stood up. He went to the kitchen. Natasha was making something for dinner. He could smell it before he came in, something with garlic, something that meant she'd been planning a proper meal rather than an efficient one, which was what she did when she was trying to make a normal evening. He looked at her back, at her shoulders, at the way she moved around the kitchen with the same efficiency he'd always associated with capability, and now thought might be something else entirely. Might be the practiced motion of someone keeping things moving, because moving things was the alternative to stopping and waiting for the thing that wasn't being said. "Natasha," he said. She turned. He opened his mouth. What came out was not the right version of this conversation. He'd like to tell you he found the right words immediately, that he said it cleanly and clearly, and she understood, and they sat down, and it was honest and open in all the ways it should have been. That's not what happened. What happened was, he said her name, and then he stopped, and she looked at him, and the stopping was long enough that she put down what she was holding, and he said, "I have to tell you something," and then he stopped again. She didn't say anything. She waited. He said, "I lost my job." She looked at him. 4 weeks ago, he said. The letter came 4 weeks ago. I didn't know how to. He stopped. He looked at the counter. "I've been going to a coffee shop." She said nothing. She was very still. "Every morning," he said. "I've been leaving at the same time and sitting in a coffee shop for 3 hours and coming home at the usual time. 4 weeks. He looked at her face, which had an expression he couldn't read, which was unusual. He could normally read her expression. "I know that's..." "Why?" she said. "Because..." He stopped. He thought about the answer he would give normally, the practical one, the strategic one, the one about buying time and not wanting to worry anyone. He thought about all the doors he knew how to close. He said, "Because I didn't know how to say it. Because I'm..." He looked at his hands. "Because I'm scared. I don't know what comes next, and I don't have a plan. And I have been sitting in that coffee shop for 4 weeks, trying to become someone who has a plan, before I had to tell you I don't have one. And I don't have one." The kitchen was quiet. Natasha looked at him for a long moment. She said, 4 weeks. "Yes." "You've been scared for 4 weeks?" "Yes." "And you were alone with it?" He didn't answer. The answer was obvious. She turned back to the stove. She turned the heat down on whatever was cooking. She did this with deliberate care, the way you handle something when your hands need something to do. Then she turned back around and she looked at him, and her expression had resolved into something he recognized now. Not anger, not the accommodation he'd been getting. Something else. The look of a woman who has been patient for a long time and is now choosing whether to be patient again. "You couldn't have told me?" she said. "You couldn't have told me?" she said again, slightly different this time. Not louder, more specific. "I didn't want you to." He stopped. He thought about the end of that sentence. "I didn't want you to see. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to be this." He said, "I didn't know how." She put her hand on the counter. She looked at the window, at the evening street. She said, "Do you know what it's like, living with someone who won't let you in? Not because you haven't tried. Just because the door doesn't open." He said nothing. "I've been trying to ask you for 4 weeks, she said. "In the ways I know how, and you've been..." She made a small gesture. "You've been doing the thing you always do. Very competent, very under control. Only your eyes have been..." She paused. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. I called the office because I was worried about you, not because I suspected anything. And then you came home and said you were handling it. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not angry, she said. She looked at him. I'm tired of being someone you perform for, Sergei. I'm your wife. You can be in trouble in front of me. He heard this. He heard it the way you hear something that's accurate and has been true for a long time, and which you've been very successfully not hearing until the moment it becomes impossible not to. He thought about 22 years. He thought about all the times he'd said fine and handled and under control. He thought about the careful management of what he showed her, the edited version of himself that lived in this house with her, still recognizably him, still genuinely him in many ways, but maintained, curated, the parts that might require something from her quietly removed. He thought, she has been married to a performance, and the performance was good, and she'd known enough to not push too hard at the seams, and they had built a real life inside of it, a real family. But the performance had been there. It had always been there. He thought about Andrei in his room. The man doesn't complain. You just deal with it. Andrei, he said. Natasha looked at him. I heard him, Sergei said, earlier. On the phone, he said, he paused. He said what I say. What my father said. He looked at his hands again, which he'd been doing all evening, as if they would have something for him. They were just hands. I don't want to give him that. Natasha was quiet. I don't want him to learn. He stopped. Started again. He's going to have things that are hard. He's going to need to tell someone. I don't want him to spend his life thinking he can't. Natasha had an expression he recognized now. She pressed her lips together for a moment, which was what she did when she was controlling something. She said, tell me what you need. I don't know yet. That's okay. I need, he breathed. I need to call Mikhail. He offered. I told him I didn't need it. I was wrong. Call him. And we need to look at the money together. He paused. I've been managing the information. You should see the actual numbers. She nodded. Okay. It's not a disaster, he said. I want to be clear. It's not... Sergei. Yes. Stop explaining how manageable it is, she said. You don't have to do that. He stopped. He stood in his kitchen and he stopped managing it. It was uncomfortable. He wanted to clarify something, to contextualize, to give the situation its proper frame so that she understood it was under a certain kind of control. He stood there and did not do that. Okay, he said. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her hand. When did this start? She said. Not the job. The other thing. Not being able to say things. He thought about his father. He thought about standing in the kitchen of his childhood, watching a man who could fix anything and apologize for nothing. He thought about learning, by observation, that strength was a closed room and weakness was what happened to people who opened the door. A long time ago, he said. Can we try something different? She said. Not a challenge. Just a question. He said, I don't know how. I know, she said, but I'm here. He looked at her. 22 years. This woman who'd been in this house with him, who'd made space for his silences because he'd never offered anything else, who'd been patient in ways he was only now understanding were extraordinary. He said, "I'm scared." 3 words. He'd never said them out loud. Not exactly like that, not in that order, not to her. She didn't say, "It'll be fine." She didn't say, "Don't be scared." She didn't manage it. She just looked at him and kept her hand on his arm and said, "I know." That was all. That was enough. He heard Andrei's door open, footsteps in the hallway heading for the kitchen, the normal trajectory of a teenage boy in the late afternoon moving toward food. Andrei came in and looked at the scene, his mother's hand on his father's arm, something slightly different in the air of the room, with the particular sensor of a 16-year-old, tuned to exactly this frequency. "What's going on?" Andrei said. Sergei looked at his son. He thought about the easy answer, the managed answer. "Nothing, sit down. Dinner's almost ready." He thought about the door and how quickly he could close it and how much practice he had. He thought about a man doesn't complain, you just deal with it. He said, "Come sit down. I need to tell you something." Andrei looked at his mother. She had a small nod. Andrei pulled out a chair and sat. Sergei sat across from him. He said, "I lost my job. About a month ago. I didn't tell you because I thought I could handle it on my own and not worry anyone. That was wrong." He looked at his son. "I'm telling you now because I don't want you to find out later and think your father hid things. And because..." He stopped. He looked at the table. He looked back at Andrei. "I heard you earlier. What you said on the phone." Andrei looked suddenly uncertain. "What did I say?" "About men and complaining." A pause. "I said that to you," Sergei said. "Or I showed you that. I'm not angry about it. But I want you to hear something different from me now." He put his hands flat on the table. Being afraid of something and saying so is not weakness. Being in a difficult place and telling the people who are with you, that's not weakness. I've spent my whole life thinking it was. I was wrong. Andrei looked at his father. He had the look of a 16-year-old encountering something he didn't have a category for. His father, talking about being afraid. His father's hands on the table, open. His father's face doing something that was not the usual expression. He said, "Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," Sergei said. "But I want to be honest with you about what okay means. It means your mother and I are going to figure this out together. It means it might take some time. It means I'm going to ask some people for help, which I should have done already." He looked at his son. "It's going to be fine. I believe that, but not because I'm pretending it's already fine." Andrei sat with this. He said slowly, "I didn't know you could be scared of things." Sergei looked at him. He thought about everything that sentence contained. The 16 years of a father made of a particular material, solid, facing outward, weather-resistant. The whole architecture of what Andrei had grown up believing his father was made of. He said, "I should have let you know sooner." Andrei nodded. He looked at the table. He looked up. "What can I do?" he said. Sergei looked at his son. He thought, this is the question. This is the one that comes when the door is open. He thought about how many times Andrei might have wanted to ask this over the years, and found the door closed. He said, "Nothing right now. But thank you for asking." Dinner was the thing with garlic, which had been on the stove the whole time. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, and the conversation was not normal, but it wasn't heavy either. It moved through the food, through Andrei's week, through Natasha asking Sergei practical questions about the timeline, real questions, questions she'd been waiting to be allowed to ask. He answered them honestly, which meant answering some of them with, "I don't know yet," which was the hardest thing, the three-word thing he'd been refusing to say for 4 weeks. He said it twice over dinner. Each time it was slightly easier than the last. After dinner, Andrei went back to his room. Sergei sat at the table with Natasha, and they did what he should have done 3 weeks ago. They looked at the numbers, the savings account, the monthly obligations, the timeline before things became critical. He showed her his phone, the banking app, the actual figure. She looked at it without performance. She said, "Okay. That's manageable if you find something in 4 or 5 months." "I think I will." "Call Mikhail tomorrow," she said. "I will." "And your brother?" He looked at her. Gennady offered. "I told him." "Call your brother," she said. "Not for the money. Just call him." He nodded. They sat at the table after the numbers were put away. The apartment was quiet, Andrei's music faint through the wall. The kitchen was the kitchen. The evening was the evening. Natasha said, "How long have you been doing this? The managing how you seem?" He thought about the honest answer. "Since I was about Andrei's age," he said. "Maybe before." Was it working? He thought about the coffee shop. He thought about the good shirt, 4 weeks of mornings, the precise performance of a man who was still a man between meetings. He thought about the particular exhaustion of it, which was different from every other kind of exhaustion. Not physical, not mental exactly, but structural. The exhaustion of holding a shape you're not sure you're still the right person to be. "No," he said. "Not for a while." She looked at him. "You can stop," she said, "with me. You can stop." He thought about what that meant. He thought about all the rooms inside the closed room, all the things he'd been managing in there alone, the fears, the doubts, the days when he was less certain than he appeared, which was most days, which had always been most days. The things that had no place in the image of himself he'd built and maintained, because the alternative was the thing he was most afraid of. He thought about what the alternative actually was. It was this. His wife at the kitchen table at 9 in the evening, looking at him, telling him he could stop. His son in his room, not performing. The apartment around them, ordinary, unchanged. The thing he'd been afraid of was this ordinary thing. He said, "I don't know who I am without it." She said, "You're the person sitting in front of me." He sat with that. He called Mikhail the next morning. He called him from the apartment, sitting at the kitchen table, not from the coffee shop, not from the car. He called and Mikhail answered and Sergei said, "I should have called you sooner. I'm looking. You said you might know someone." Mikhail said, "I do. Let me make a call today. I'll get back to you." He said, "Thank you." He said it without managing the word, without making it smaller or more casual than it was. Just, "Thank you," a thing received. He called his brother after. Gennady answered on the second ring. Sergei said, "I wanted to call about Mama's knee. And to tell you, I'm in a transitional period at work. The company restructured. I've been figuring it out." A pause. "Since when?" "About a month." Sergei. Not angry, not reproachful, just Sergei. "I know." "Why didn't you say anything?" He thought about the honest answer again. He was getting practice at it. "I didn't want to need anything from anyone," he said. "I'm working on that." His brother was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom's knee is actually not bad right now. I exaggerated a bit. I was looking for an excuse to call." Sergei said, "You can just call." "I know. So can you." He sat at the kitchen table after both calls, with his phone and his coffee, in his apartment in the middle of a Tuesday morning. He didn't have the good shirt on. He was in the shirt he wore at home, the soft one, the one that didn't mean anything. He thought about what happened next. There was still no plan, not a complete one. There was Mikhail's contact and a few other possibilities and the numbers on his phone and a realistic timeline. There was uncertainty, which had always been there, but which he'd been refusing to look at directly. He looked at it now. It was uncomfortable. It was also, he was discovering, survivable. The discomfort was just discomfort. It was not what he'd been afraid it was. It was not the end of the image he'd built, because the image was already gone, had been gone since Thursday 4 weeks ago in Human Resources 2 paragraphs. What was left was just him, in a soft shirt, at a kitchen table, with a phone and the coffee and the wife who was down the hall working and who had said, "You can stop." He thought about Andrei at breakfast. His son had come in as usual, slightly rumpled, slightly elsewhere, moving through the kitchen the way he always moved through it. But before he left, he'd stopped at the door. He'd said, "Dad." Sergei had said, "Yes." Andrei had looked at him for a moment. Then he'd said, "Good luck today. The way you say something when you know something. Not casual." Deliberate. Sergei had said, "Thanks." He sat with it at the kitchen table. There was a lot still ahead of him. He understood this. The job search, which was real and would take what it took. The adjustment to whatever came next, which might be the same thing and might be something different. The process of learning, at 47, how to let people be in the room with him when things were hard. That was the long one. That was the one that didn't have a timeline. He thought about his father. He thought about the man in his memory, capable, contained, the man who fixed things and said little, and whom Sergei had spent his life trying to become. He thought about whether his father had been afraid of things, ever, in the quiet of a room alone. He thought, of course he was. He thought, I just never saw it, and because I never saw it, I thought the fear was the failure. He thought, I'm going to let Andrei see it sometimes. Not everything, not the performance in reverse, the performance of vulnerability. Just the ordinary truth of a person moving through ordinary difficulty, not alone. He thought, that might be the whole thing. He got up, he washed his cup, he looked out the window at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning doing its ordinary things. He picked up his phone. He called Mikhail back, not because there was news, but because he'd thought of a question he'd forgotten to ask. Mikhail answered. They talked for 10 minutes. It was a normal conversation, a practical one, the conversation of two people working something out. He hung up and thought, that was fine. He thought, I could have done that 4 weeks ago. He thought, I'll do it differently now. Not everything at once. Not a transformation, not a sudden arrival at some better version of himself. Just differently. One conversation at a time, a little less managed, a little more present. The door a little less closed. Natasha came into the kitchen at noon. She looked at him. How'd it go? She said. Good, he said. Mikhail's making a call. I talked to Gennady. Good. She went to the coffee machine. He said, how's your morning been? She turned and looked at him. The question was ordinary. Husbands asked it all the time. But she heard what was underneath it. The actual curiosity, the actual interest, the not performing interest version. She said, difficult. The presentation's not working, and I can't figure out why. Tell me, he said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. Tell me. She sat down at the table with her coffee. She told him about the presentation. He listened, not fixing, not solving, just listening, which was not nothing, which was actually harder than fixing, which he was only now understanding was a skill he'd never learned, because he'd always moved through listening to the part where he could do something. He listened. She finished. She looked at him. I think it's the opening, he said. You're starting with the context instead of the question. She tilted her head, thinking about it. Maybe, she said. Try the question first, he said. See if it moves. She nodded slowly. They sat at the kitchen table with their coffee on an ordinary Tuesday, talking about her presentation. Outside, the city moved. Inside, the apartment was warm. He thought, this is what I was protecting myself from. This, her voice, the ordinary back and forth of two people who know each other and are letting each other in. He thought, I don't know what I was so afraid of. He sat at the table with his wife and drank his coffee. The shirt was the soft one. He didn't need the other one today. Maybe tomorrow there would be a meeting, maybe a reason for the gray shirt, maybe the beginning of whatever came next. Maybe not yet. Either way, he thought. Either way, if something in this reached you, the mask, the exhaustion of it, the moment when someone asks to be let in and you finally let them, write something in the comments. Not because it fixes anything. Just because naming a thing, even once, even briefly, is different from carrying it alone. We'll see you next time.